I want to be upfront with you before I start. I was not a Linux evangelist. I was not someone who spent weekends in terminal windows arguing about package managers. I was a Windows user. Genuinely, comfortably, completely a Windows user. I built my first PC on Windows. I learned video editing on Windows. I knew the registry, the services menu, the group policy editor, the hidden performance tweaks that most casual users never touch. I was the person in my circle that everyone called when their Windows machine had problems, because I knew how to fix things. I defended Windows in comment sections when people complained. I told people Linux was for developers and enthusiasts, not normal human beings who need their computer to actually work. And then 2025 happened. And then early 2026 happened. And the machine I had spent years mastering slowly stopped feeling like mine. Let me take you to the exact moment I started questioning everything. It was late in 2025. I was in the middle of a project, deep in a workflow that had taken me hours to set up, multiple applications open, files in progress. The kind of session where interruption doesn't just annoy you, it costs you real work. And Windows decided that this was the moment, not a suggestion, not a request. A notification that my PC would restart in 15 minutes to install important updates. I tried to postpone it. I went into settings and tried to pause updates. It told me I needed to install a specific update before I could pause anything. I tried disabling the Windows Update service through services.msc. I tried third-party blockers. I did everything the forum said to do. The computer restarted anyway, and when I came back to it, there was a fresh lock screen with a Microsoft 365 advertisement sitting on top of the mountain wallpaper I never chose, and all my open work was gone. That was a turning point in how I thought about this relationship, because that is what it is, a relationship. And that day I realized it had become a very one-sided one. Now here's what made 2025 particularly brutal for Windows 11 users who were paying attention. Windows Latest documented over 20 major update problems across 2025 alone. 20. The very first security update of 2025 broke audio for users with USB digital to analog converters. A March 2025 update caused boot loop issues that Microsoft had no immediate workaround for, and ultimately recommended uninstalling entirely. October and November 2025. Updates caused measurable FPS drops in games, which NVIDIA eventually had to address with emergency driver releases. The February 2026 security update, KB 50777181, caused continuous restart loops that prevented users from accessing their desktops. Microsoft's official guidance: uninstall the update. That is what you're being told to do with mandatory updates you had no choice but to receive. Uninstall the thing we forced onto your computer because it broke it. And what was Microsoft focused on during this same period of cascading update failures? Embedding Copilot into Notepad, into the snipping tool, into the Photos app, into File Explorer, into the taskbar. A Microsoft Windows latest article put it plainly: a big part of the problem was focus. While core parts of Windows kept breaking update after update, Microsoft was busy pushing AI into every corner of the operating system. And that Copilot situation is where things got genuinely Orwellian for me. Between October 2025 and March 2026, Microsoft was silently force installing the Microsoft 365 Copilot application onto computers belonging to Microsoft 365 subscribers, not offering it, not suggesting it, installing it without asking. And during that rollout, a critical bug emerged where Copilot could access confidential emails on affected systems. An application you did not choose to install was reading your private email. Microsoft paused the rollout after the backlash, acknowledged the bugs, and then in June 2026 started forcing the installation again with a target completion date of July 1st. PC World reported this directly. Read that cycle again slowly. Force it, break something serious, apologize, pause, then force it again. That is not a company that respects the boundary between their software and your personal data. That is a company that has decided your computer is a deployment surface for their products, and your consent is a minor inconvenience in their roadmap. I want to be fair here because fairness matters. Microsoft did eventually announce changes in March 2026. Fewer Copilot buttons, easier ad disabling in the Start menu, a promise to focus on stability. Windows Central called it Microsoft finally admitting the OS had gone off track. And I read that announcement carefully, every word of it. And what I noticed was that not one of those changes was something Microsoft came up with because they genuinely changed their philosophy. Every single one was a response to collapsing user trust, stagnating market share, and a tech community that had started using the word enshittification as the standard vocabulary for describing what Windows had become. Improvements born from market pressure are not the same thing as improvements born from respect for users. And understanding that difference is exactly why, after over 2 decades on Windows, I finally decided to find out what Linux actually looked like in 2026. Not what people told me it looked like 10 years ago. What it actually looked like right now. Here is what I expected. When I first booted into a Linux live environment, I expected to feel lost. I expected a command line staring back at me, asking me to manually configure drivers, compile something from source code, and possess a computer science degree just to connect to my Wi-Fi. That was the picture I had carried in my head for years, built from old forum posts, decade-old YouTube videos, and the confident opinions of other Windows users who had never actually tried Linux themselves. I downloaded Ubuntu first because it has the largest community and the most documentation. I used Rufus to flash the ISO onto a USB drive. I plugged it in, booted from it, and within about 40 seconds I was looking at a fully functional desktop environment. No installation, no commitment, just a live session running, entirely from the USB drive, letting me test everything before touching my actual system. And I sat there for a moment, genuinely surprised because it looked nothing like what I had imagined. The desktop was clean, organized, the animations were smooth, Firefox opened immediately, and YouTube played without a single issue. I opened LibreOffice and created a test document, made a spreadsheet, poked through the interface. It was different from Microsoft Office, yes, but different in the way that Chrome is different from Edge. The bones are familiar. The logic is the same. You figure it out within minutes. Then I did the thing I was most nervous about. I started testing my hardware. I have a setup with a gaming mouse that has programmable buttons, a mechanical keyboard with RGB lighting, a USB audio interface for recording, external storage drives, and a Wi-Fi adapter. On Windows, half of this required manufacturer software, manual driver downloads, and periodic reinstallation when updates broke things. On Ubuntu, running live from a USB drive with zero prior configuration, everything was detected immediately. The RGB on the keyboard lit up. The mouse buttons registered correctly. The audio interface appeared as an output option in sound settings. Wi-Fi connected on the first attempt. Bluetooth paired my headphones without me doing anything. I genuinely had to check that I hadn't somehow accidentally installed something because it felt too straightforward. This was the first crack in 20 years of assumptions. I spent the next several weeks doing serious homework before committing to anything. I watched dozens of hours of comparison videos, read through Linux subreddit threads going back months, cross-reference distribution, recommendations across multiple tech publications, and specifically sought out accounts from people who had made the switch from a Windows power user background, rather than people who had always been Linux users. What I found consistently was that the conversation around Linux desktop usability had shifted dramatically between 2023 and 2026. The distributions that were being recommended for Windows switchers had matured significantly. Linux Mint, with the Cinnamon desktop environment, was coming up repeatedly for people who wanted the most familiar transition, with a taskbar layout, file manager, and system settings structure that maps almost directly onto what Windows users already know. Zorin OS was mentioned for the same reason, with a specific Windows-style layout option built into the installer. For people who wanted something more modern and visually refined, KDE Plasma on Kubuntu was the overwhelming recommendation, and that ended up being what I chose. The software question was the one I kept circling back to because it was the most legitimate concern I had. I do video editing, I do photo work, I use communication tools, browsers, and various productivity applications daily. So I went through my actual installed software list, program by program, and researched each one specifically for Linux compatibility in 2026. DaVinci Resolve has had a native Linux version for years, and it is the exact same application. No compromises. OBS Studio for recording and streaming is native on Linux. Audacity for audio editing is native on Linux. Blender for 3D work is native on Linux. VS Code for any coding work is native on Linux. Discord has an official Linux client. Spotify has an official Linux client. Steam, which we will get to in a moment, is fully native on Linux with years of dedicated development behind it. The browser situation is identical to Windows. Firefox, Chrome, Brave, all available, all running the same as they do anywhere else. The photo editing question required the most honest assessment. GIMP is the open source alternative that gets recommended most often, and I want to be straight with you about it. GIMP is not Photoshop. The interface is different, the workflow is different, and if you have 15 years of Photoshop muscle memory, there will be a real adjustment period. But GIMP handles layers, masks, curves, filters, and color correction competently. And for most photo editing tasks that do not involve extremely specialized professional workflows, it gets the job done. There's also Darktable for raw photo processing, which I found genuinely impressive in the quality of its output. And for the specific cases where I knew I would need Photoshop itself, Wine exists as a compatibility layer that translates Windows application and calls into something Linux can execute. I tested Photoshop CS6 through Wine before making any decisions, and it ran without crashing, without visual glitches, and without any behavior I would call unreliable. The compatibility story in 2026 is meaningfully better than it was even 2 years ago. Now let's talk about gaming, because this is the question that keeps more people on Windows than any other single factor. And I want to give you real numbers rather than vague reassurances. Valve has been building Proton, a compatibility layer that translates Windows Game API calls into Linux equivalents in real time for several years now. The Steam Deck, which runs a custom Linux distribution called SteamOS, forced Valve to invest heavily in making this technology work reliably at scale because millions of people were using it as their primary gaming device. By 2026, independent gaming databases report that roughly 75 to 85% of the top 1,000 most played Steam games run on Linux either natively or through Proton. That is not a small selection. That is not scraps. That is the overwhelming majority of the games most people actually play. I went through my own Steam library before switching. The compatibility ratio I found was consistent with those numbers. The major titles I play regularly either had native Linux versions or had gold or platinum ratings on ProtonDB, which is the community database where players report their actual experience running specific games through Proton. Games that do not work are almost exclusively those with kernel-level anti-cheat systems. And that is a business decision by those publishers, not a technical limitation of Linux itself. Valorant, for example, uses Riot's Vanguard anti-cheat, which does not support Linux. If that is a game you play competitively and cannot live without, that is a genuine and specific limitation you need to weigh. For everything else, the compatibility situation in mid-2026 is genuinely impressive. So I made the decision, not impulsively, not out of frustration alone, but after weeks of methodical testing, honest research, and a clear-eyed assessment of what I would gain versus what I would genuinely lose. I backed up everything important to an external drive. I downloaded the Kubuntu ISO, flashed it to a USB drive, booted from it one final time to confirm everything still worked the way I expected, and then I clicked install. I chose to erase the drive completely. No dual boot, no safety net partition with Windows sitting there as a fallback, full commitment. And I want to tell you why I made that choice specifically, because a lot of guides recommend dual booting as a starting point, and I understand the logic, but for me personally, having Windows 1 reboot away would have meant reaching for it every time something on Linux required 30 minutes of research. The friction of full commitment was the thing that forced me to actually learn the new environment instead of retreating to familiar territory the moment anything required effort. The installation itself took 14 minutes. I timed it. 14 minutes from clicking install to sitting at a fully configured KDE Plasma desktop. No product key to hunt down, no mandatory Microsoft account creation that required an active internet connection just to finish setting up my own computer. No 17 screens. Asking me in slightly different wording whether I was absolutely certain I did not want to enable telemetry, advertising ID, activity history, location tracking, cloud sync, and Cortana. Just a handful of straightforward questions about language, keyboard layout, time zone, and a username. Then 14 minutes, then done. The contrast with a fresh Windows 11 installation, which I had done recently enough to remember clearly, was stark. Windows 11 setup in 2025 is a gauntlet of dark patterns. Buttons that say things like Use Express Settings, which silently enable a dozen data collection features simultaneously. Options to decline Microsoft account. Creation that are deliberately harder to find than options to create one. The entire experience designed to extract as many agreements as possible from users who just want to get to their desktop. Linux Mint asks me where I live and what I want to call my account. The philosophical difference between those two setup experiences tells you almost everything about the relationship each operating system has with its users. The first week on KDE Plasma was an adjustment, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretending the transition was frictionless. There were muscle memory moments where I reached for keyboard shortcuts that did not exist or looked for settings and locations where they were not. The package management system was the steepest learning curve for me specifically. On Windows, installing software means going to a website, downloading an executable, running it, clicking through an installer, and hoping the download source was legitimate. On Linux, it means either opening the software center and searching by name or opening a terminal and typing a single command. The terminal version felt unfamiliar at first, but within a few days, I realized it was actually faster and significantly safer. There is no hunting through Google results trying to determine which download link is the real one and which is a malvertising trap designed to look identical to the official site. You type the program name, it installs from verified official repositories, and it is done. Every application on your system updates through a single unified process, rather than each application having its own separate updater running in the background consuming resources. The customization reality of KDE Plasma is something I was not fully prepared for even after reading about it extensively. On Windows 11, your customization options are essentially limited to light mode or dark mode, an accent color, and whether you want the taskbar icons centered or left aligned. Anything beyond that requires third-party tools, registry hacks, and the constant risk that a Windows update will break your modifications silently. KDE Plasma, the customization system, is native, stable, and genuinely comprehensive. I move my taskbar to the left side of the screen in about 4 clicks. I changed the application launcher style. I set different wallpapers for each of my virtual desktops. I adjusted animation speeds, enabled window blur effects, configured how windows behave when I snap them to screen edges, and set up a hot corner that shows all open windows when I move my cursor to the top left. Every single one of these was a built-in setting with a toggle or a slider, not a workaround, not a hack, not something that might stop working after the next update. I spent the better part of a weekend configuring my desktop environment to look and behave exactly the way I wanted. And I want to tell you what that felt like after years of Microsoft deciding how my interface should look regardless of my preferences. It felt like ownership, actual genuine ownership of the machine I was sitting in front of. By the second week, I started noticing the performance differences in ways that were impossible to ignore. My system boots in under 10 seconds, not from a cold start to the login screen, from power button to fully loaded desktop with my startup applications running under 10 seconds. On Windows 11, with the same hardware, the same SSD, the same RAM, boot time was consistently around 35 to 40 seconds even, with fast startup enabled. Application launch times are faster across the board. File Manager opens instantly. Web browser with a dozen tabs restores in seconds. And the memory usage difference is the one that genuinely shocked me. I run a browser, a communication app, music, and usually a background task of some kind as my baseline setup. On Windows 11, that baseline consumed around 65 to 70% of my RAM, leaving the system feeling sluggish when I added anything demanding. On KDE Plasma, with identical usage patterns, that same baseline sits around 35 to 40%. The same hardware is doing the same tasks with dramatically less overhead because the operating system is not running a telemetry pipeline, an AI assistant, a cloud sync service, a delivery, optimization peer-to-peer node, and a dozen other background processes that exist to serve Microsoft's interests rather than your workflow. And then there's the privacy reality, which is where everything comes together in a way that I find difficult to overstate. On Windows 11, I spent real time and genuine effort trying to minimize data collection. I went through every privacy setting. I disabled optional telemetry. I turned off activity history. I used third-party tools like O&O Shutup 10 to address telemetry that the settings menu could not reach. And then Windows would push a major update and reset half of those settings without telling me. Researchers in 2025 and 2026 documented this pattern repeatedly. The settings reset cycle is not a bug. It is a structural feature of a platform where data collection is the default state and privacy configuration is the exception that gets periodically cleared. On Linux, there is no telemetry, unless I explicitly choose to enable it. There is no advertising identifier. There is no activity history syncing to a corporate server. There is no AI assistant analyzing my files in the background. My operating system does not phone home. It does not treat me as a data source. It runs my applications, manages my hardware, and otherwise stays out of my way. The absence of that. Constant background surveillance is something I did not fully appreciate until it was gone, because you cannot feel the weight of something until you put it down. Here is what I did not expect. I did not expect to be more productive. I expected to break even on productivity. After a learning curve, maybe settle into something roughly equivalent to what I had on Windows, but with better privacy. That was the trade I thought I was making. What actually happened was different. Within a month of full commitment, my workflow was faster. Not marginally faster, noticeably, measurably faster. The absence of background processes competing for resources meant that when I was editing video, the system was actually dedicating its power to editing video rather than splitting attention between my work and a telemetry pipeline deciding what to send to Redmond. The absence of forced update interruptions meant I could work through a session without the anxiety of a restart notification appearing at the worst possible moment. The absence of ads in my interface meant that every time I opened an application or navigated a settings menu, I was looking at my tools and nothing else. These sound like small things individually. Cumulatively, they change the entire texture of a working day. I want to address the objections that I know are sitting in your head right now because they were sitting in mine for years and they deserve honest answers rather than dismissal. The first one is the learning curve, and yes, it exists. I will not pretend it does not. But here is the specific shape of it. The first 2 weeks require Genuine adjustment. You will search for things. You will spend time in forums. You will occasionally need to open a terminal and copy a command that someone provides in a thread. After those 2 weeks, daily computing on Linux is not harder than daily computing on Windows. It is different, but different is not the same as difficult. And the skills you build during that adjustment period are actually yours in a meaningful way. When I fixed my printer issue on Linux after about an hour of research, I understood exactly what I had done and why it worked. When I used to fix printer issues on Windows by downloading a manufacturer installer and clicking through it, I understood nothing about what had happened and had no idea how to handle variations of the same problem. Linux asks slightly more of you up front and gives you genuine competency in return. Windows holds your hand in a way that creates dependence rather than understanding.